Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Spotlight. In the past week, we've been taken on a rollercoaster of news, opinions, public debates, and social media hyperactivity. From the sacking of SBS sports reporter Scott McIntyre for tweets he made on Anzac Day evening, to the executions of the Bali 9 drug smugglers, to the Freddie Gray riots in Baltimore, we are left with ambiguous emotions hard to decipher. With me in the studio to discuss how these events impact our society is Dr. Yasir Morsi, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Centre of Muslim and Non-Muslim Understanding at the University of South Australia. Dr. Yassir's main area of research is the critical analysis of contemporary racism and Islamophobia, and he regularly speaks about the struggles facing Muslim minorities living in the West. Dr. Yassir, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Sports reporter Scott McIntyre was sacked after 10 years of service with the SBS for some tweets that he made about the Anzacs that were deemed inappropriate. The Australian Human Rights Commissioner Tim Wilson has defended SBS's right to sack McIntyre on the grounds of employment contract, and that this has nothing to do with freedom of speech. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the first and most obvious point is one that we all intuitively know as Muslims, and that freedom of speech has certain limitations about what you can say, who you can attack, what you can challenge, and what you cannot. That's to Wilson's comments. It's interesting because falling behind the veneer of law, I mean, law is not neutral in this sense, nor are contracts. And if the contracts are determining what you can and what you can say, it's still a limitation of freedom of speech. It's still determining, preemptively determining, as a role as a journalist, where are the zones that you can speak and where are the zones that you can't. And it's part of that broader debate. But I'll bring it back to the initial point. You as well as I, as a lot of people, especially those of minority communities, know that there are certain things you cannot talk about.
Now, Muslims across the world were outraged when Charlie Hebdo released some cartoons that were inappropriate about Prophet Muhammad ﷺ under the banner of freedom of speech. If the Anzac legacy is as sacred to Australians as Prophet Muhammad is to Muslims, why is this any different?
Well, it's interesting because, I come from an academic background, and the Anzac history is challenged in various different ways, but when it enters the public space, it becomes a different type of challenge. It's often about who's doing it, when they're doing it, and how they're doing it. And, it would be interesting to see, and let's imagine, hypothetically, imagine a Muslim said this kind of things, what that would mean. But to answer your point, yeah, I do think in the absence of maybe what we may call a religious symbol, the nationalist symbol of the Anzac spirit defending the nation, being attacked, and brings about, it kind of resonates with what we were trying to say about the certain things about our tradition, our way of life that goes beyond questioning.
Bali 9 executions have made huge news across the world, especially in Australia. How do you think the media's covered and portrayed the unfolding of these events?
Well, I'll make a distinction between mainstream media and other forms of media. So I've read a lot about it, and in the mainstream media, it's quite, I use this in a neutral term, it's very disappointing. I won't mince my words actually. It's quite racist at times, the way Indonesia is described, the way the expectations that Australians have of Indonesia, the threats. Now, whatever your opinion may or may not be about the death penalty, yes, is one issue. The way that it's covered and spoken about, the way Indonesia's corruption has been brought into the debate at key moments to legitimize any other debates about the concept of sovereignty. I think Indonesians listening to Australians talk about Indonesia would find it deeply offensive. And I think the way it's been framed as a humane story of trying to save life belies Australia's track record in regards to asylum seekers, our attitudes towards other Australians that are in death row. It's really strange, and it seems like there's this nationalistic, and you may tie it back to the Anzac spirit, this nationalistic sense of pride that's being attacked. Who are these people to kill our citizens? And I might ask the audience, since when has Australia shown this much protection over Asian Australians who so happen to have committed a crime? And it's only when they can begin to discuss Indonesia as this menacing neighbour who we've given aid to, whose sovereignty should be determined by what we've done for them. I found it quite troubling, but as I said, I won't mince my words. It's so often the case that it's framed by an overall historical racism.
It's quite interesting that you actually frame it as a racism type of portrait, because it's people don't see it like that. They see it as two Australians who've served some sentences, who are now reformed and should have been sort of given leniency and mercy.
as I said, whatever one's attitude is to the death penalty is one thing. You can make that argument. I mean, I had no problem, for instance, using this case as opposed to, say, the 4 Nigerians who were also executed, and we heard very little about, 3 Nigerians and 1 Ghanaian, actually. We heard very little about their backstory, their families, and their cases, yeah? I have no problem with this incident being a platform for a broader discussion about the role of the death penalty. Yeah, let's see. I mean, what does drugs do to a society, and how should it be? You know, what's the correct punishment for that? That's one debate. But the way it was framed is another more interesting issue for me.
Speaking about the way it was framed on the media,
yeah,
or by the Australian government defence?
Well, even the idea that the Indonesian offended our Prime Minister by not, you know, they were rude to them. It's really interesting because now we're talking as if these countries are personalities, you know. These are highly bureaucratic processes and, you know, they're involved all forms of diplomacies. And to mix and match, it's almost as if you were talking about a soap opera. You know, look what I've done for you, why don't you do it for me? You've treated me badly. We're talking about nation states. We're talking about international convention and law and so forth. And in that sense, if I had no problem with the debate about death penalty or even promoting these 2 men as a way to have that discussion, but it became a little bit more. It became about what Indonesia owed us. And in that sense, it was deeply disappointing.
A very interesting sort of perception on this particular issue. I'll take you across the other side of the world to Baltimore, where we've been seeing quite a lot of riots.
Yeah.
As you're well aware, what are your thoughts on this, and how does this relate to racism?
Well, it's the underlining. I should take a backward step here. As a race scholar or somebody who studies race, racism is so often determined in mainstream society as the kind of bad comments you may hear on a train. One's attitude towards a minority. But it's so much more than that. I mean, we've heard the term institutional racism, but it goes even beyond that. I mean, part of what we're discussing is how the media has framed one story and neglected another story. In the name of what's humane and humanity, they tell a story, but they also neglect other stories.
Such as?
Well, for instance, plenty of people, like okay, we talk about extradition and returning people back to death penalty, and that's against what we are, and we shouldn't do that. But if we look at what Australia does with asylum seekers, it's exactly that. People come here to avoid punishment from countries that they've fled, and we put them in detention centres. I mean, if we're talking about this kind of spirit or notion of our care for life, you can't pick and choose when it's suitable. If we're going to talk about that, then bring the debate about asylum seekers, bring the debate about what's happening with Indigenous people in close communities. And it's that framing. I mean, it's not simply about having a bad attitude towards a minority, which may or may not be the case. It's also about how you tell your story. And our story, it privileges a certain group of people's self-serving sentiment of who they are and neglects other. And in the case of Baltimore, it's a reflection of both institutional and material forms of racism that precede all of this. I mean, we've only seen a few of the African Americans who have been shot by police. We've only seen a tip of it. This violence towards that community has existed for centuries. And the way Obama has framed it, the way the media has framed it, the way these images enter out of rioting and so forth, belies how we've neglected to tell an overall story of what it means to be African American in America. And that story is rarely told. What happens is we always see them enter into our public consciousness through violence, through the moment after, and that's the only way. It's the same issue, not politically, but the same issue with the way media frames Muslims. We only ever enter public consciousness the day after an event occurs, where violence becomes the platform upon which we have to speak. And that does not tell the story about where we come from and what we're faced against.
As a scholar on racism and Islamophobia, what's, in your opinion, the way to change the status quo on racism?
One of the solutions is to stop playing therapist. It's not our job to correct racist views in society, because you empower it the more. Our job is to speak to those who are most vulnerable by racism, to empower them, to tell them that you don't have to justify the way you look or the way you think, you're not on trial constantly, because a lot of racism's results are psychological. You grow up your whole life conscious of your difference, and that becomes a huge burden of how you interact. and how you're confident, how you even whisper it. It becomes embodied in many ways, and it's a politics of affect. You don't know how to, we develop what they call a double consciousness. You have your own self and the self that you present to society because you have to protect yourself. So a lot of it is talking about to those who are under the crosshairs of racism, and not just about correcting the way we're perceived. That means intra-faith, that means discussions with other minorities. And forgive me for being long-winded about this, one of the most tragic things that I find is we spend way too much time reaffirming the white mythology of Australia as a fair-go country, as a democratic and multicultural place, because we recognize that this is an image that is celebrated. We spend a lot less time speaking about Indigenous histories, speaking to Indigenous people about, you know, our shared understanding of what it means to be in Australia as a minority. Now, what we suffer is nothing like what they suffer, but at one level, and forgive me for playing with words here, we're also Indigenous. Not to Australia, but we're Indigenous to another land that has also suffered the form of colonialisation and so forth. And it's bringing those histories together that I think is a far more fruitful attack against racism.
We definitely have a long way to go in the fight against racism. Dr. Yasir Morsi, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having Barakallah Feek.
And thank you for watching. You can join the conversation on our Facebook page or send us your show suggestions to spotlight@onepathnetwork.com. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.